All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to day two session of Ideal Training. My name is Afreen Khan, and I'm going to be training you all with respect to how exactly the format and everything is going to go with, and also like how the speaker roles are going to be. I think yesterday we dealt with the modified WSTC format and then how the juniors and middle and seniors format actually looks like. I think you all are aware about all of it. So that bit is clear unless and until anybody else has a question with respect to the format. Um, and if you have any doubt, please raise your hand first and then unmute yourself because it's very difficult otherwise for me to track you all. Cool. Then what is the speaker role and why it is important? I think each speaker in the debate has a different role. The reason why there are different roles of different speakers is not to restrict the kind of like debate it's going to be, but rather to make it more interesting and make it more fair, right? Because if there are no speaker roles, everybody is literally going to talk about the same thing because the motion is same for everybody. And therefore, there's going to be no elaboration or no extension in the debate. And therefore, it is already defined as to who is going to be defining the motion, but also it's always fair to have like a limit in terms of first speaker and of the proposition and opposition defining the motion. Otherwise, it's going to be like, oh, the third speaker is defining the motion and the motion can never be debated um, properly because it's going to be unambiguous or like ambiguous till the end of the debate. All right. Moving on to the first speakers, I think first speakers is already clear. So I'm not going to go in detail, but I think I just wanted to come back to this for a quick activity. But before that, I think I want to like clarify what third speakers actually do. So third speakers are the VIP speakers, and the job of third speakers from both the sides is more or less similar, right? Because they are supposed to respond. I think the last time when I dealt with the VIP speeches, I had collaborated what is the job of third speaker and reply speech together, simply because we weren't having reply speeches, and therefore it's always good to have as much amount of content in third speaker as opposed to like not just dealing with responses, right? So right now what I'm going to deal with is specifically what happens in the third speaker, that is the VIP speaker of the WSTC. So the first thing and the most important thing that the VIP speaker is supposed to do is respond to the other team, which means that you're not just supposed to respond to the new material that has come from the second speaker of your opponents, but also are supposed to like respond to the responses of the opponents, right? Which means that, look, for example, your proposition has given an argument. Now, opponents respond to that argument. Now, your responsibility becomes that you're supposed to also respond to the response that has been given to your argument, right? Which means that you're not only like defending your own case, but you're also responding to the like response that are being given by the opponents, which means there's something which is called as counter responses. And that's what you're supposed to do for sure in the third speaker. Because if you don't do that, I think the rebuttal of opponents, if it is very important and if it is very like credible, I think judges are going to buy that. And therefore, your claim that you made initially and which was supposed to be your argument is taken away by opponents, right? So always remember that response is the most important thing that you're supposed to do as whip speaker. The second thing then is that the bulk of the speech should be dedicated on defeating the arguments brought by the other team in detail, which means that it's not just a rebuttal that like, look, this is what they said, but we believe this. But I think you're also supposed to like explain as to why you believe a particular thing, as opposed to just saying that, oh, it doesn't happen or it's just untrue. I think oftentimes and not, like debaters try to rebut the arguments by just saying that, oh, what opponents are saying is untrue and it does not happen. Tell us as to why it is untrue, or tell us why it's unlikely to happen in the first place, right? Next thing that you're supposed to do is that if it is technically permissible for you to like dedicate 1 or 2 minutes of your time to give additional arguments. Now, why this is important is that remember when the last time I told you you can give new argument, you can give new examples and new substantiation. This simply like related to that. But this time it's like given to you specifically that you can give some amount of time in order to like give additional arguments. But these arguments cannot be so new that has never been initiated or introduced by your teammates. For example, and that's why exactly why first speaker's job is extremely important. Can anyone tell me what is the job of a first speaker?
It's
Yeah.
to basically start the debate and lay out the points and the meanings to
Okay.
start our
Set the motion, define the agenda of the proposition, the
Okay.
stakeholders included, and the definition on what the debate will be built on.
And also, you have to give the first few arguments. Yes.
Correct. So what Sudarshan said is that you have to give first few arguments. Yes. Was anyone
Is it like
able
a
to-
synopsis of your all 4 speeches in one?
Exactly, correct. So what you're supposed to do in the first speech is also supposed to give like a synopsis as to which speaker is probably going to be dealing with which argument.
Ma'am,
Yes,
ma'am, the first speaker sets the context.
correct. The first speaker sets the context, defines the motion, gives what are the arguments that the judges can possibly expect, but also gives some amount of like extension as to what the arguments are, like present some amount of their case as well, right? But the synopsis part is important for the third speaker. For example, if the first speaker says that there are 3 arguments that are going to be dealt with my side, and the first argument is going to be dealt by me, the second argument is going to be dealt by the second speaker, and the third argument is going to be dealt with the third speaker. If this is the case, then third speaker can elaborate on that argument. But if it is not the case, and there was no mention whatsoever that the third speaker is going to elaborate on that particular argument, or there was no mention whatsoever of that argument itself, I think then third speaker cannot go ahead and give that additional argument in their speech. Then the only job of third speaker is to go ahead and respond to the opponents. I hope I've made it clear. Any doubts in this?
No.
Okay, cool. So I would assume like, okay, so there are no doubts.
I
So
had a question.
yes,
So the first speaker must mention that one of the arguments will be elaborated upon by the third speaker. However, they cannot say that there will be a fresh argument given by the third speaker. Correct?
yes. So the mention of what is the argument is necessary. So even if the first speaker does not tell that this particular argument is going to be dealt by this particular speaker, it's still okay. But as long as the mention of that argument is there, that's all right for the third speaker to go ahead and elaborate on that.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. So moving on to what is the job of the reply speech. Cool, the reply speakers. So remember when I told you about the clashes and I like collaborated it with the web speeches? I think the clashes job is specifically for the reply speakers. So what do they do? Reply speech is a very short speech, like it's for 2 minutes or 3 minutes for you all, right? So what we're supposed to do is that tell as to why you won the debate, because it's the last speech of the entire round. So tell as to why you, your side of the house, won the debate, and boil down the entire debate into 2 to 3 overarching like points of contention. So they are basically called as clashes. So if you think that there is something that proposition and opposition were colliding on, for example, a particular stakeholder as to why workers are better in your side of the house, but opponents say that no, workers are better off in my side of the house, I think then it's a clash that is existing in the debate. Therefore, it's the job of the reply speaker to go ahead and tell that I'm going to tell you as to why the stakeholder of workers is going to be better off in my side of the house. And that doesn't mean that you're going to completely elaborate on that, because if that stakeholder is actually better off in your side of the house, it would have been already dealt by the first speaker or the second speaker or the third speaker, which means that reply speaker have to just like give flags as to what are the like arguments that you're winning, not necessarily the details of why exactly you're winning that clash. So you can simply say that we think that workers are going to be better off in my side of the house simply because they're getting more job opportunities, or they're getting more wages, and therefore they can like live in my side of the house. So you don't even have to like tell us to why they're getting more jobs in your side of the house, or like why they're getting more wages, because it's something which is already dealt by with your first or second or third speaker, right? So the reply speech is supposed to be telling that judge, we identify 3 clashes in the debate, and then these are the clashes, these are the reasons why we win. That doesn't always mean that you're supposed to always concede to the idea that all the clashes are being won by you, but I think as a biased adjudicator, you always can like prove as to why that particular argument is being won by you. But that doesn't mean that you can concede or trade off a particular argument. For example, you can say that, look, panel, we think that like opponents or like prove to you that why economy is going to be better off, but I think we prove to you that why political system of India is going to be better off, which in like anyways is going to be like impacting the economy, and therefore we already take down that clash. So you don't directly say that why economy is going to be better off in your side of the house, but you take down or you trade, like make it a trade-off with the political system argument that you were probably running in your side, right? So like you can tell why you win the particular clash, or why opponents weren't necessarily doing a particular thing better. So you can say that, oh, we win the debate because they never defined the motion, or they never gave you the substantiation of a particular argument, and so on and so forth. So reply speakers are basically biased adjudicators. They tell you why, they basically tell why you win a particular debate, as opposed to like giving details of like like a particular argument, like particular response or something like that. So basically reply speakers cannot give responses or new rebuttals or new arguments, not at all, but then they can like tell why they won the debate based on whatever has happened in the debate earlier. So last time it was club and this was told as whip speeches, but this time whip speeches in WSDC are going to be only dealing with the responses plus the counter responses and like additional argument if it has been already mentioned by the first speaker. Are there any doubts? Yes, Advait?
So the whip speaker still cannot add any new information, right?
They like new information as in like completely new argument and completely new stakeholder?
No, I mean, like in the previous debate, how it worked was that if you want to rebut any points given by the previous deputy or either the previous whip, you need to use the arguments already given by your prime minister or deputy. So is it possible, like, because now this is a reply speech, that we can add in new information for the whip?
You cannot add a new information, but in case if you think that something which has been mentioned by your previous speakers but was not elaborated a lot, you can like link it back to that argument and then elaborate on that point, if that makes sense. Okay, Aman.
Yes, ma'am. I'm Adwait's teammate. So just to give you a little more clarity on the question, essentially in the previous debates, the whip was only supposed to take the main clashes from our understanding and then give an adjudication of why our side won the debate. And to prove that why our side won the debate, we were only allowed to use information that was given by the previous two speakers.
Correct.
Can the whip, to prove that our side has a better argument, provide new information, or does he have to rely on the information given by the two previous speakers?
He obviously has to rely on the information that has been given by the first speakers, because the time when I told you that like in order to respond to the responses, you're supposed to like link it back to the argument, because say that's just the example. Let's say proposition gives an argument A, the response to that by opposition is B, and then proposition has to respond to the like response B, right? And therefore you come up with C, right? But that doesn't mean that C and A are independent like entirely. C obviously has to connect to A. So that means that you can give new rebuttals anyhow in government whips. So I don't understand why that is problem. So you can give new rebuttals. That's not a problem.
All right, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So essentially the third speaker in WSD format does what the second speaker would do in the nation parliamentary?
According to the modified Asian parliament that we all taught you, I think yes.
Okay, understood.
Cool. Moving on to the but then there's still one thing that the third speaker cannot do as exactly to the second speaker of AP, because I think second speaker of AP still has the liberty to like introduce new argument which is not related to the first speaker, right? But then you cannot do that here in third speaker.
Understood.
Cool. Moving on to the first speakers that I want you all to like participate in this. Okay, I think we talked to you about like first speakers and what did they do in terms of like defining the motion. But the reason why it is important specifically here is because the motion that we're going to give you for semifinals and finals are mostly going to be dealing with the policy and this house would motions, as opposed to the previous round where you were given the motions of this house believes that motion. Now, what exactly happens with respect to this house would motion, I'm going to deal with that later. But in terms of still how you're going to like define the motion, I still want some amount of like understanding from y'all. So I think I've already told you like defining the motion, outlining the arguments and presenting part of your case is extremely important. However, you still need to think as to like when you're defining a particular motion, there are two things that you're supposed to like keep in your mind. Firstly, what is the a reasonable, intelligent person is going to have the understanding of the motion, which means that what do you think a particular, like what do you think a reasonable person would understand when they're reading the particular motion? But secondly, do not time set the motion or place set the motion in a specified area. But that doesn't mean that you can like, so what that basically means is that you cannot say that in a debate, which is this house would legalize drugs consumption, you cannot say that, oh, this debate happens in 19th century, because it's unfair for opponents to respond to that. Obviously, this debate happens in this particular area, which is like, this debate happens in the status quo. But secondly, I think when you are like explaining the motion, you're also supposed to say that what are the most important words in the motion. So when you say that this house would withdraw membership from UN upon its failure, what do you think like the failure is of UN? What do you think? How would you characterize failure? You can raise hands and I can tell you who can start speaking. This house would withdraw membership from United Nations upon its failure. Now, firstly, obviously, what is the failure that we're talking about? And what would be the criteria in order to judge that it is a failure? Yes, Sudarshan?
I'm not sure, but after the Russia-Ukraine war, probably.
Okay, so what is the nuance of it? Like, why do you think?
Because it's like a humanitarian crisis. Also, it affects the citizens. And in a
Correct.
contract, it said that no citizens should be harmed during like a war or a conflict. But in the Russia-Ukraine war, like thousands of people like are dying, right?
So the first criteria would be like failure to prevent humanitarian crisis, wars. Correct. Nishka?
Yes. So maybe if the UN sends peacekeeping forces somewhere, but they don't really work because the war still breaks out in that nation or that area, then that can also be like a direct failure of their actions.
Correct. So that would be basically, I think the inability or like inefficiency of UN in order to have peace being established. That's also a good criteria. Anybody else? Okay, so that's pretty much it, I guess. So I think like the way how you actually like see the motion is that what do you mean by this house would withdraw membership, and like what would be the failure, obviously. Therefore, the moment when you're seeing the word failure, don't specify it to a particular incident, but you can obviously give references to a particular example, right? So the way how I think Sudarshan did was like, okay, because they weren't able to stop the Russia-Ukraine war, but like start with from the nuance of the argument. So the nuance is like, oh, the any time when UN is not able to like prevent humanitarian crisis, it's going to be considered as a failure. And then you can give examples of several wars that like UN wasn't able to stop, correct? And then you go ahead and like tell that, okay, if it's not just that, but we have several criteria. So this is the time when you actually define the policy, and that's something which is called as policy. So how, when, what of the particular debate could be like the policy. However, let's go on to like what exactly could be the definition and how exactly this matters. Okay, so this house would allow corporal punishment in schools. So the things that you're supposed to answer is that who will deliver the punishment? Is it going to be the school nurse? Is it going to be a head of discipline, any given teacher? So you're first telling as to who is the actor, right? And then you go ahead and like who can issue the punishment. So just like there are actors, there are sub-actors. So is it going to be the senior staff? Is it going to be all the staff? So is there a particular restriction as to who can give it? That's also the thing which you're supposed to answer. The third thing that you're supposed to then see is like, what is the punishment? So you define as to what would be the punishment. Is it like slapping? Is it what is it going to look like exactly in schools? And then what can be the punishment which is going to be given? Like, is it going to be like for like serious breaches of behavior such as violence? So you basically not just like define the motion specifically, but you define the situation as to when it's going to be implemented, right? So you tell that, look, corporal punishment means this, and the reason why it will be given is this. Who will be giving it? Why will it be given? Or like, how will it be given is something which is called as policy. So you're supposed to like completely define like intricacies of how it will be implemented in real life, as opposed to just like debating the benefits or harms of a particular thing. Now, obviously, in these motions, I think our first speaker can always counter the motion. I think I've already told you why and how a definition challenge actually happens. But definition challenge does not mean that you're always going to define or like challenge the definition, because just do it in the rarest conditions when you think that the proposition is like very uncharitable, because it just literally makes the debate very messy, and then the judges have to use their own criteria unless and until you give a criteria for them to like tell as to which definition is better. So if you think that the definition is fair enough, just concede to that. It doesn't mean that your marks are going to be reduced when you concede to the definition. It's always a better thing to do. Cool. Then what are the kinds of motions that we're going to like talk to you about? Before that, how many types of motions are you all aware of? Just raise hands and tell me what motion are you like. Are you on? Okay, Nishka.
There are mainly two. I think one is about policy making and one is just on moral grounds, maybe on truths.
Correct. I think that's also present in WSDC manual. Cool. Yes. So it's truth versus policy debates in most of the WSDC format. But I think there are other kinds of motions as well. Eamon, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I had the same moral ground one. I've participated in WSTC, so I wanted to say about that.
Yes, so that's like primarily how many kinds of motions are there, but there are also like different other motions, like this house regrets, this house opposes, this house supports, everything else as well. But we're going to only deal with this house would motion because I think this house believes that is already dealt with. So let's start with what are this house would or this house will motion. So this house will or would motion, whenever you see these terms, this THW, assume that it's going to be a policy debate. And a policy debate is like when the motion implies that a specific actor should or should not do a certain policy. So when you say proposition, obviously supposed to like implement a particular policy, and then opposition is supposed to say that why that particular policy should not be like used or implemented, and what are the harms of that in the subsequent matter. So for example, if the motion is this house would require university students to work in their country of origin for a number of years after graduation, the motion suggests that the government should implement this as a policy and will require explanation of how exactly that works and what the policy will look like. Now let's start with like this simple motion and like try to understand what could be the policy. Does anyone want to give a try as to what they would form as a policy in this motion?
Which motion?
This house would require university students to work in their country of origin for a number of years after graduation.
Maybe give a context before heading on to the policy. For example, there are very talented Indians who have to go for MBBS abroad to countries such as Ukraine, not necessarily because they don't have the funds, but also because they don't get a college. Hence, they can still come back and practice because MBBS is a universal qualified degree. And then we can talk about how many brilliant people usually go abroad, but if we can get them to at least work back for a few years, they can give back to the country. And that would be the logic part, and then the policy part.
Okay, so the logic part is actually very important, because whenever you see a policy motion, that doesn't mean that you're simply going to go ahead and like implement a policy without giving a justification. So justification is the first step in order to set up a policy, because whenever governments come up with a policy, or for that matter anyone, they're supposed to first tell us to what is the aim of the policy and why they want to have this policy in the first place. I think Aditya told, I think in terms of this particular motion, you can say that, there is existing like brain drain which is happening in this nation, and therefore we need to have this policy into picture. But then still you're supposed to give what is the policy. Now tell me what could be the policy in the motion.
Probably is a policy little more specific. So it would probably like be like something a university student should work in that country for like a specific number of years, or like for example 3 or 4 years, at least 3 or 4 years. So
correct. So you can first define the number of years after the graduation which is necessary. Correct. What could be the next thing?
I don't remember the name.
Something we could do is that for students who are enthusiastic to go and study abroad as soon as the graduation is done, for if this was to be implied, after working for a specific amount of years, the government would give them some sort of assurance that they will go abroad and study. That because of them working in the country, even though it was against their will, they will get a chance to study abroad. Maybe that could be a plan of action to make sure that the citizens comply with this and not protest. because
Correct.
that will lead to the instability of the country, then the government and just lead to a bigger problem.
Yeah, correct. That could be.
Another important factor here is time, right? If few students want to like study abroad in their first college years, because over there they get to learn more information, and so like specifically learn in a specific field of study that's like really prominent in abroad colleges. If they just do their first college in India and then like second college if they want to go abroad, but like they won't learn properly, and it would probably be better if they could go in the first college. So that could also cause a lot of riots. So I think another factor that's important is India should bring like more better universities and colleges to persuade the
I think the point, if I may, the point of the debate here is not to say how they'll study. It's about them staying back and working after they're done studying. Sure,
Yeah,
we should
I
have
think
better
what you-
universities.
Yeah. I think what Sudarshan said was that we need to sustain people in India, and in order to do so, we need to like give better universities. But I think that's exactly what opposition is going to run as a counter policy, because I think proposition is trying to retain them in the nation as opposed to trying to have better universities, if it makes sense. So the
And
reason,
so here, the
yeah.
proposition will not classify that the student should live in their country of origin. They will just classify why. But then the opposition can classify that why not, like why they shouldn't live, what are the disadvantages in their particular country, and how they should improve first, and then come to this motion. That will be the argument of opposition, right?
Yeah, that they can do that, and they can, no, I think they don't have to necessarily say that they can come back to the policy, because then you're conceding to the benefits of the policy that proposition is saying. However, what you can do is that on opposition you can say that we shouldn't have this policy at all, and then we should have a counter policy, which is like having better education system and having better opportunities in terms of job, and therefore it will automatically incentivize these kids to stay in India as opposed to going outside, right? So what proposition is trying to stop is brain drain, but you can specifically do that in opposition by giving better chances or better opportunities in India, so they don't have to go outside.
Yes.
I think
So we
when we were
don't
doing
have
up,
to. So we don't necessarily have to disagree with the motion by the proposition, but instead suggest a different one, which might come to the same result.
Correct. Yes.
I think
So,
in our
yeah.
orientation, IDL had given us 3 different ways to rebut. One was is that the solution is secretly bad. One, the problem is not big enough. And then the last one was is that the solution is the wrong one.
Correct. So there are 3 ways. One is that you first tell that okay. So first you can say that, and I was going to come back to that. So firstly, what you're supposed to say is that why exactly this policy is not efficient enough, and therefore come up with the flaws of the policy itself. Secondly, therefore you can say that why the policy is not going to work. Secondly, you can come up with a counter policy and say that the solution that proposition is giving you is actually bad. Or thirdly, you can come up and say that why we don't need to use that amount of money or resources in order to solve the problem, because the problem is not big enough, and therefore come up with alternatives to alternative problems that are already existing, and therefore we should probably give more importance to that thing as opposed to this. So yeah, Aditya, you're correct. Cool. So I think when I asked you for policy, I was looking forward to the details of what the policy is going to look like. So for example, from proposition, what are you going to define as to why or how governments can implement it? For example, government can start with having a particular database of knowing what are the people who are staying in universities. But secondly, what does it mean when they say that they would want to require them to stay in the nation? Does that mean that they're supposed to work, or what kind of works are going to be given? So you can probably define as to if the government is there, the government is going to go ahead and give some amount of is going to give some amount of jobs for these individuals, and what are these jobs going to look like? Because opposition can always come back at you and say that, oh, we don't really have jobs, or the jobs that are going to be there are probably going to be menial jobs. So you're supposed to respond to that and say that no, that's not necessarily going to be the case, because the way how that works is that if government is implementing this policy, we are obviously going to create more jobs and stuff like that. So I think that's what policy actually means, and that's how it's going to be. Cool. The next thing then is the policy motion need not necessarily be just about governments either. It can advocate the individuals or organizations ought to do or not to do a certain thing. So for example, if it is this house would not consume art created by people who have committed deeply immoral acts, I think you can obviously say that this house does not necessarily mean that it's government. It can be individuals who consume art on a regular basis and therefore they don't have to do it right now. Cool. Now this is the motion. Yeah, so these are the debates that are actually existing, and you should probably watch them. They're pretty good debates, and I've actually judged them in the previous rounds in Oxford and Dogsbridge. So yeah, I think you should see these debates in order to know how it actually works and how the flow of WSTC works. Yes.
Ma'am, why does it say India versus Canada
Because
instead
it
of
was
like
India versus.
Because it was India versus Canada.
It was India versus Canada.
Ma'am, I have a doubt about the last slide. If you could kindly move to
Yeah,
the
go
next
ahead.
one. It says that the House will not consume art created by people who have committed deeply immoral acts. Can I, as either side, proposition or opposition, can I not say that I would separate the art from the artist?
You can see it from opposition, and you can see
Yeah.
that why, yeah. Do you want to say something?
No. My doubt is clear. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, that was pretty much it. That's what we wanted to talk about in today's session. Unless and until if you have any doubts.
Could you please talk about more about how to pick a policy, or if you have proposition, how do we delve into the policy itself? Because
Cool. I'll just share my screen again. Wait. There are more slides. Okay. So if it is a motion which is talking about this house would heavily tax corporations which automate their workforce, the approach could be several things, like why do we need this policy? What would be the policy and how would it look like? And what are the benefits and then impacts? Now, the first thing and what could be the policy, how the policy could look like is that what is the cap of automation? Like, what do you exactly call as automation? Do you say that they cannot use any kind of machines and machines or machineries whatsoever, or are you saying that a particular thing, for example, using software or anything of that sort? But then you can go ahead and say that automation in our city house is going to look like any time when they're going to remove the number of human force in order to replace them with a particular machine or a way which reduces, or a machine which reduces human input and therefore causes harm to a particular number of amount of people whose jobs are going to be taken away. So you can say that we define the situation as when the number of humans working is reducing in a particular corporation, or when the number of people who are fired as a result of automation or as a result of machinery being used, we are going to think that this is the time when they are automating their workforce. But secondly, what would the tax look like in the policy? What are you going to tax them? Are you talking about which kind of tax firstly are you talking about? But secondly, how would it be taxed? So is it going to be proportional to people fired? So you can be creative and think as much as you can in terms of how are they going to be taxed. So here I've taken the example of it's going to be proportional to the number of people fired. So for example, if they have fired, let's say 40 people, it's going to be increased to 4%, something like that. So you can come up with quantity as in how you like it, and therefore you can go ahead and what would be the tax and how it would look like. I think the reason why tax and what would be the quantity is important is so that there is more clarity of whether the tax is going to be extremely high or low. So but when I say that 40 people are actually removing, and when I use the example of 4%, it doesn't seem a lot, and therefore opponents can always question you and say that, oh, you're not actually defending the motion because the motion says heavily, and therefore it should be at least more than 10% or 20% and so on and so forth. So I think opponents can always question as why the policy enough itself is not going in line with the motion. The third thing then is why is it okay, and why and giving the justification of like, oh, there is like exploitation of labor, there is lower wages, there is unemployment, etc. So this house would heavily tax corporation could look like the policy as to how you would implement it. So for example, say that the government has the ability to do it in terms of like, they have the database, they have the ability to track the corporations that are existing, therefore they have therefore it's going to take into the census of like the number of people who are working in, let's say, 2019, and then they're going to say that how many number of people are actually working in 2021, and then they're going to ask like why exactly there has been like a reduce in number of force, and therefore they're going to come up with a plan of like taxing these corporations. So is it going to be monthly basis, going to be like yearly based, all of that. So these are the things which you like include in your model, and then you can dwell upon that. And obviously like opposition can come up with a counter model to solve it. So like in terms of like this motion as to like why this house would heavily tax corporations, opposition can come and say, look, we don't need to tax them, and like you can come up with like reasons as to why taxation does not really work. But you can also come up with a counter model and say that, oh, imposing cap, you can probably impose cap on like recruitment of people. So therefore like you would obviously give them a cap that if a particular corporation is like having a return of, let's say, this much amount of money, they are supposed to recruit let's say 100 people per year. So this is going to be like putting a check on these individuals to always keep recruiting human force as opposed to like automating the work so that there is like less amount of unemployment. I think that's how case preps actually work. But let's also take this motion and understand how the policy could look like. So this house would make promises made by politicians in position of power enforceable. So what do you think is going to be the first step in the motion from proposition?
Mama, I have a doubt.
Yeah.
If the politicians are in positions of power, wouldn't it be their moral responsibility to put their promises in action?
Yeah,
If they
so that's
already
a
are
moral
in power?
Yes, so that's a moral responsibility, but you can still not like question them in terms of law, and you cannot sue them in court of law.
Wouldn't that be in their political manifesto, which is supposed to be shown to the citizens?
Wouldn't that be?
In their political manifesto.
Yeah, it could be correct, but then a lot of times people make promises on in terms of, let's say, when they are in a political rally, or when they're like making speeches in order to like convince people in the rallies and everything, and then they make particular statements that, oh, we're going to have like better C-wage system and stuff like that, but they don't necessarily include it in their manifesto. Therefore, these things or these statements are also going to be considered as promises, and that's exactly why it's like important, right? Then in the policy, you're supposed to tell what promises are you talking about. Is it the manifesto, or is it the thing that you're saying in terms of like general statements that they are making in rallies? So this is what the policy is going to look like in proposition then. So it's up to the policy.
So would the beginning be that how we explain that unfulfilled political promises would weaken the spirit of democracy in a democratic republic like India? Then we could further go on and talk about how many people are affected by politicians who promise them things. Give them an example. For example, I read about this, that India's billions baby, it was supposed to be a landmark, was promised funding from the government, but 20 years later, they still haven't helped or given any money. So it just talks about how politicians get fake propaganda for votes and publicity, and that how that is not correct. And by implementing policies, we can restrain this with law and order and the judicial system.
Correct, you can do that. And I also think that like you can also link it back to accountability, and the reason why we need to have like higher amount of accountability on politicians on proposition, and then justify it. And you can always say that like, look, they often tend to like manipulate like the poor sections of the society, and therefore in order to do so, they make fake promises so that like the sentiments of the poor sections of the society is taken is being hurt, and therefore like they would essentially vote for you. But then after they vote for you and after you get into power, you don't necessarily do that particular thing. Yes, Advair.
So you can also say that suppose a politician has promised you 5 rupees per vote, that is illegal. Thus, if this house would make promises enforceable by politicians, it would also make the illegal ones. Because like that's exactly what the
I mean, if you're saying that like,
okay,
this house would make no, I think like yeah, I think I want to like tell this particular thing. Okay, so when it comes to like something being enforceable, it first has to be legal. So if you're talking about politicians essentially promising some amount of money in return of votes, I think firstly it's illegal, which means that like it's not going to be enforceable to an extent that they're going to pay back that money. But yeah, it's enforceable to an extent that politicians are going to be behind the bar if they do so. So they're regardlessly going to be behind the bar.
so whatever you
for
just said
corruption.
would be applicable if the, if the first, proposition side clearly defines the fact that this enforceability is applicable for legal promises, right? Otherwise, you could put in the point.
Correct, yes. Are there any more doubts?
Yeah, I thought about another point. I was not sure if that would pertain over here, but could I say that basically when politicians have fake promises, it loses the sight of the larger picture because you're misemploying legal instruments for short-term political gains, and it puts the trust of the people at risk, and it's also undermining institutions. So that would lead to a lot of mistrust. Would hence the manipulation of rules. It could create antagonistic relationships among stakeholders. Could we also say that this would lead to political centralism, where people would start going for nota in elections, hence meaning that more votes would go without any electoral value, making elections a little more complicated?
Yeah, that's perfectly correct. I think you can also like link it back to the principle of democracy and why we need to uphold the institution of democracy in and of itself, and like how it works on the good faith of people on the politicians. Otherwise, there is no reason why people should vote on what you're promising them in the manifesto or otherwise. And therefore, the reason why they're voting you is because of that. Yes, that's correct. Any other inputs on this motion?
What would the opposition say here? Because it becomes tricky.
Is there anyone who has like a case for opposition here? No one? Like, can you all not think of anything? I mean,
For this motion only?
Yeah, for this motion itself.
I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
So mainly, I think this would also discourage many people standing as candidates. So, for example, to make a lot of promises enforce, to enforce a lot of promises in the first place, a lot of candidates will require resources, and that does not necessarily mean that all of the independent candidates standing in elections will have that kind of resource. So, what we are going to be doing here is we are going to be discouraging them from standing for elections because they'll know that they won't be able to make promises that they can't keep. Whereas the other ones with more resource, with other candidates with more resources will be able to fulfill the same promises they make.
I mean, like when it comes to the promise that they make, I don't think they use their own resources in order to like fulfill those promises. They use the resources of the government, and therefore I don't think how it's going to be completely relevant. However, I think that when you go where you're going to like run that argument, it's going to probably look like and I think proposition can always counter that by saying that, oh, we don't necessarily need such kind of like politicians regardless. So if they are like so scared of like making promises and then fulfilling it, it's better to not have them as opposed to having them, and therefore the harm is not big enough. But yes, that was a good try. I think what you can possibly run on opponents is that what it essentially does is that politicians will end up making like very menial like promises, and therefore things which are like very small, like smallest of the smallest things, because then they are going to be always like scared to even like put a particular thing which they are probably capable of, but they won't be able to do like completely 100% because obviously they're scared of like getting behind the bars and stuff like that. The reason why that is important is that a lot of times, a lot of like things that are being promised by the politicians are not always in bad faith, right? The reasons why a lot of things don't get passed in the parliament, or like the reason why they're not probably like being able to have the implementation of sewage system and everything, is because of the lack of resources by the government itself. So if you use the argument of government resources as opposed to like a particular thing, I think that would be better. However, I think the reason why other reasons are like probably like shortage or like other other reasons in terms of emergencies, or like, you know, there was flood, and therefore, you know, like the ability of politicians to be able to like manage or reallocate funds in different things which are more important. So for example, if there is flood happening in West Bengal, the politicians would probably prioritize funding in like trying to save those people from flood, as opposed to like probably making a particular thing which they have promised in the manifesto. So you can talk about like the dynamics that exists in the democracy, and then link it back to like why promises are always like not always made in terms of bad faith. Yes, Eamon?
Ma'am, someone you just said that having this policy or having or going with this motion, it would tell people who wanted to run for like, let's say, prime minister or anybody, or for any position of power essentially, it would make them more cautious, right? Because if the promises had to be enforced, it would make them think again, right? That's what they said. So but when you're running as a politician, it's not like you just learned what it is the night ago or a month ago. You have years of experience here, and you know what the stakes are. So wouldn't that argument be fruitless here? Because they know what they're getting themselves into. They know the rules. They know the Rajya Sabha, the Lok Sabha, everything that comes with it, and the promises that comes with it. So wouldn't that argument be fruitless about them thinking again? Not like entirely, but wouldn't it lose a major part of its importance?
As in like politicians thinking again to stand in elections, or politicians thinking again for promises?
Standing in elections, they would know what the stakes are if
Yeah,
they're standing in the elections.
Yeah, that's true. That could be a good response from proposition, yes.
Could we also say that sometimes the opposition does not know what exactly the problem is, and once they gain power themselves, they understand the magnitude of the situation. For example, there were some files which were asked by the opposition to be declared, but when themselves they formed the government, they said that it wasn't feasible for them to declare those files publicly. So can we also say that necessarily always these promises cannot be fulfilled due to the situation around them and how sensitive the topic is?
Yep, that is yes, that's a way to deal with that as well. Any other inputs? I think you can anyone think of a counter policy to this? Like, how can we possibly bind the politicians and make them, you know, better in faith, and therefore they wouldn't necessarily go ahead and like try to manipulate the needs of the people and try to have the vote bank politics through these promises? What do you think could be the possible counter?
Maybe
Laying down,
making laws for politicians about what they speak.
I think that's exactly what the proposition is doing.
making
Oh,
political
that's right.
ethics.
Making political?
Ethics.
How does that work?
So basically, instead of making a policy which hands down just makes it so brutal and it's just making the picture like black and white, people need to understand that sometimes people vote politicians in the wrong way. For example, a person might claim that politicians have promised them something, but in reality, that's not true. So if we had guidelines to lay down at places where politicians would rally and have it recorded as such, so that there's a witness to every time a politician promises something, and it can go to a court where they can see if the promise is feasible or not, and then take action accordingly.
I mean, that's something which would happen in proposition. Yes.
I
You
think
cannot-
that would not be a long-term solution, because if that was to be put into action, the number of politicians that would come in court would be unquantifiable. Because that's the saddening situation of our country.
And I also don't think I think proposition can still have the same thing because you don't get charged like simply in the courts if you don't have witnesses who prove that a particular thing was done. So yeah, I think this is like a template counter policy that most of the debaters done in opposition. The template policy is awareness and education. So if you create more awareness in the society about how politicians are probably like manipulating you and stuff like that, I think the way how a good voter should deal with that is probably by looking into the past of the politician or whether the politician was being able to fulfill the promises that they have made. But secondly, what is the kind of like development that the politician has made as opposed to the current like promises that the politician actually is making, right? Which means that it makes the people more aware or like more sound in terms of the choices they're making, and therefore they would be more likely to choose a better politician, and therefore the politician and the way how they're going to act is going to be better, and therefore you don't need to essentially put these people behind the bars, and I think that's probably also going to save the idea of vote bank politics and stuff like that. So I think our education and awareness is one of
Okay,
the
I think I got a different angle to this.
Yeah, tell me.
One thing is that the Election Commission has a model code of conduct for the was laid down way back in 2014 for the general elections, and it's guidelines which were mentioned that restrict the parties from developing promises which should promises in the manifesto that would have a undue influence on voters. So influencing voters in the wrong way, there's already something in place for that. So maybe you could say that. And also we can say that promises made by political parties are not legally accountable. So hence.
Yep. I think you can also go ahead and talk about like the idea of, I think there's a response from proposition for that, but I think the idea of contractual liability and how that actually works is like offer and then acceptance, and then like, there's a proper way of going about that. But then when it comes to simple promises, they're not necessarily contracts, and therefore there shouldn't be a liability behind that. And that's the principle of contractual liability. But I think the proposition can always come back at you and say that, oh, there is a social contract that is existing between the government and the people. So yeah, this debate can go back and forth like really.
I always feel that the proposition will have a upper hand in this debate.
Yeah, that's a bias that we have, but I'm sure that there's like good arguments on opposition as well. So if you disprove, so the way to do it is like if you disprove that politicians are never going to be behind the bar, irrespective of whatever promises that they do, is the reason is the way how you can get away with that. So the way how you can do it is that politicians oftentimes and not have good capital, which means that they're always going to have a better ability to defend themselves in court, and they would always have better lawyers, and therefore they would always get away with these like promises, because promises are like literally small things that the politicians are probably doing wrong. They get away with like crimes which are extremely like heinous. So you can talk about that and say that the policy in of itself would not have the benefits that proposition is trying to prove forward to, but you can also come with like better like responses to or like better solution to the problem.
Okay, understood. So basically there's something like, so apparently we can also say that even the politicians might be put behind bars, they'll still be controlling the political environment through their parties. For example, in Bihar, Lalu Prasad Yadav was jailed, but still his wife controlled the seat of power. Hence, it doesn't matter. Rather, putting in a code of conduct would be more helpful.
Yeah, so you can say that we don't want to like be in the same cycle of like vicious politicians running the system. We want to like create precedents, which is essentially going to make them like make the voters more. Also, I can also think of like one more thing from opposition. I think on opposition, you can also say that like if this politician is not fulfilling their promises, I don't see a reason why they're going to be re-elected in the next term. So isn't that enough of a deterrence for the politician to make fake promises and not fulfilling it? Because that's the deterrence, so that's a punishment that is being given to you. Like, I think the one thing that politicians care about the most is their ability to sustain their power and their ability to have the thrust of the power, right? So if you take away that power from them, that's essentially something which is going to like probably deter them from like making further promises which are not going to be fulfilled.
Understood.
Yeah.
Can we all understood? So that's the crux of the whole debate, I guess.
Yeah. Eamon,
Yes.
your hand is raised.
No, I had a previous question. It has been answered.
Okay, cool. Advait.
But another point you can add in is the fact that politicians, once they make a promise, it's not really the fact that they don't stand by it, but it depends by the promise and when they do it. Because, like, suppose it's a 5-year long term for the politician, then the politician would make it at the elections time, saying that I'll do this if I get into power. But however, if it's a maybe the promise is not valued that high, as in like it's a very small thing to do, as in they could say I will as in they could say I will connect all the villages by proper roads. I mean, like, many of them already have proper roads, so it's like not such a big task. But whenever the election time does come, they actually stand by the promises, thus making it, I mean, like, they will stand by the promises, but they're not in time. I mean, they'll take 5 years till the next elections come to bring that thing up in the crowd, that hype up in the crowd.
Yeah, that's correct. But I think like when proposition is going to make that claim, they're also going to make a time frame of when the politicians are able to fulfill that promise. So even if it is like by the end of 5 year, like at the end of 5 year, they're still on that term. So they are still fulfilling their promise, right?
So it's just like full of loopholes. As in, like, if you are able to address all the loopholes, the opposition won't have anything to say.
Yes, correct.
If you leave one, then I mean,
Yeah, that's why it's a balanced motion match.
And this motion was fun. Last thing, can we say is that according to right of speech, it's not legally binding unless you sign on paper. So the even though it's morally wrong, a politician can say what he wants to, because
yeah, you can use the argument of like whatever is morally wrong is not actually a wrong in eyes of law. So you can use that analysis.
I think the need is the fact that they need to keep their promises, and the action which they take is what you decide, and the outcome is also kind of what you decide.
I have a question.
Yes.
Over here, you said that politicians should always make, like, if they make promises, they should always fulfill them. But how does it apply to them? Like you said previously, that all the money is going to come from the government. So how does it like apply to the
correct? So but then okay, this is the way, right? So they're not using their own money, but they're using the money of the government, which is the revenue of the government, right? But they still have the executive power of like deciding where the money goes and how the money or the funds are going to be allocated. So that's when their discretion is actually like put into play. So that's why the motion is like, oh, if they promise that, oh, I'm going to have like pipelines of water in all the village, they still have the ability to use the government resource and allocate that fund in that, as opposed to probably like utilizing their money in like probably making their own mansion somewhere. So that's what I meant.
You know, eventually I'm going to be giving up in this debate, and I'll just say the problem isn't big enough. And there are much bigger problems at hand in India, which we should focus on.
Yeah. Or you can also say that's actually a good reason. So you can also say that like the courts have better things to deal with, and therefore don't like burden the court with these cases, because these cases anyways will take like a long time, considering the ability of politicians to influence the judiciary as well. So yes.
The court has rid the hands of corrupt politicians. It's out of their league now.
Yeah.
Also, specifically, if like the promise is like really large scale and requires a lot of money for one politician, if that kind of promise is requested, and for another politician, some really small scale kind of activity with some really less money required. So over there also, I don't think it would be fair. And also, if there are too many large scale projects, wouldn't the government's money be spent unwisely? So
yeah, correct. So you can always say that this could be the reason, but I think proposition would say that, oh, look, but politicians are going to make and should make promises which are feasible enough, right? So then they should consider the amount of money that's going to be taken in that particular project and stuff like that. But yes, a good point. And I'm going to stop this right now, and we should probably have
Ma'am, you're mute.
Yeah, so I was saying that we should probably have a mock tomorrow. And
Ma'am, time?